We're talking to Lamar Waldron for the full hour. He is the historian, JFK historian, author of Legacy of Secrecy, along with Watergate, The Hidden History, and The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination. We're specifically talking, this is our fourth annual conversation with Lamar, about the relationship parallels and interrelationships between Donald Trump and Richard Nixon, and how that can, back in our first conversation, in fact, it was months before the election, Lamar said, basically, based on all this stuff, I predict that Donald Trump is going to win the White House using the same techniques that Richard Nixon did, and sure enough, Lamar was right. So now we're talking about how can we use this information to have an informed discussion about Trump in a way that might lead to his impeachment or certainly his defeat. So, Lamar, we've talked, and I don't know how much you want to amplify on this, that Trump and Nixon both used racism to turn out the vote. They both used intolerance and hatred, even when it wasn't racially directed, Nixon against the hippies and whatnot, Trump against liberals and Democrats and that kind of stuff. They both are masterful manipulators of the corporate media, and also Nixon went beyond bending the law, beyond simply being a bad politician, to actually breaking the law and being a criminal. I'm assuming that you're seeing a parallel there between Nixon and Trump as well.
Oh, so many. But before we dive into that, let me just point out a couple of other things that you just said. One, in terms of the racism and intolerance, which is, of course, another part of fascism, right? The sad fact is racists have been providing the margin of victory for many Republicans since Nixon in his so-called Southern strategy, which was kind of a soft form of racism that didn't use the N-word, that moderates could feel okay about voting for Nixon. So I'm not saying that all conservatives or Republicans are racist, but I'm saying it's simply a statistical fact that racists are the margin of victory for a lot of Republicans since Nixon. He's the guy that perfected that. And of course, here's another sad fact: both Nixon and Trump are really more elitist than racist. I mean, Trump in the 50s, Nixon in the 50s was regarded as definitely a moderate on race, and it was only in his 1960 campaign. In fact, most blacks in America were still voting Republican, from back with the
all the way back to Lincoln,
right?
Yeah.
And so it was only the 1960 election when Martin Luther King was arrested and put in this horrible jail in South Georgia and may well have been killed there, and there were all these appeals to do something, and Nixon, he wouldn't speak out.
Nixon was vice president at the time and running against John Kennedy for president.
Exactly. Vice President Nixon, who had the power to even do something, he could have sent federal marshals to get him out of this something that was half a step from a chain gang. Yeah. He didn't. JFK did, and that was a big switch. So, but the sad fact is, Nixon then turned to racism, for votes. Trump's the same way. People forget. I heard just on TV the other day, and it reminded me, Trump used to be really big with all the African-American rappers in America. They would mention him in their songs. They would hang out with him. Trump even dated a black woman after one of his many divorces. So for them, it's just a cold, calculated strategy for votes and money. And they play on that conservative and basically moderate anxiety over losing their white privilege, and they just do it so well. You mentioned the manipulation of the media. That a lot of that started with Nixon and a guy named Roger Ailes that was Nixon's media advisor, and of course Ailes went on to found Fox News, and we see how that goes. The other sad fact is the mainstream media pretty much supports Republicans. They help to make Trump the nominee. I never heard anyone in the mainstream media say Trump was an alleged billionaire or a self-proclaimed billionaire. No, CNN, he was a billionaire. And so, the mainstream media, they ignored Trump's incitement, by the tweet of what turned out to be that horrible Pittsburgh massacre. Even the white nationalist, his Orlando kickoff just the other day. The mainstream media pretty much ignored that. So that's what we're all dealing with. But still, even with all that, as you said, it's not just hardball politics. It goes into actual breaking of the law, and we'll take them one thing at a time.
Okay.
Starting with the illicit money. I mean, both men profited hugely from the presidency. Nixon, by basically when he was shaking down corporate America and wealthy people when they wanted favors or legislation, and he would get money for his campaign, he would also oftentimes literally pocket some of that money. And profiting from foreign governments, they both do that. Again, Nixon would just get direct contributions from, like, the brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran, or Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines, or the Saudi dictators. I mean, they would just literally give, the president cash. And then some of that cash would be hidden through shady real estate deals, and that's Donald Trump's middle name. But Richard Nixon was a big part of that. That's how he increased his net worth so hugely during the time he was president. He used his best friend, Bibi Rebozo, to handle a lot of those real estate transactions because Rebozo had his own little private bank that they could launder that money to. And in fact, they both, Trump is now under investigation from Deutsche Bank and stuff for the laundering of money. A lot of people think that's at the core of all the Russian stuff. Nixon literally laundered his money with the help of Bibi Rebozo. But one thing I have to add, at one point they actually bought a coin laundry down north of Miami to use for their money laundering operations because, of course, a coin-operated coin laundry, you can't prove what money comes in to that,
Right. If you show up with $1,000 in quarters, where'd that come?
Well,
right. And that was.
Or you just say, oh yeah, hey, a lot of clothes got washed this month. We,
right.
We suddenly got $100,000.
And it's all in cash.
Yeah. And so it's, and then hiding and not paying their taxes. People oftentimes forget that when Nixon gave his "I'm not a crook" speech, that was not at all about Watergate. That was after it turned out he was hiding his taxes, and then he had practically paid no taxes. And so, they're just, when you add like the not paying the taxes to getting all this illegal, money, because when I say shady, Trump's shady real estate deals go back to the mid-'80s. He was one of two developers in New York City that would sell condos and buildings to blind corporations, where you didn't know who the real buyer was. Most developers wouldn't do that because, that was oftentimes going to be mafia money or drug money. Trump was one of only two developers that would do that. And so that brings us literally up to today, and Deutsche Bank and all that money laundering and stuff, and all the stuff that's not in the Mueller report.
Yeah, which is pretty astonishing. How did Nixon and Trump get involved in all these crimes? I mean, were they lifelong career criminals?
Pretty much, yes, exactly. In other words, let's look at Nixon. When Nixon was a teenager, they used to have. You're old enough. A lot of your listeners won't, but you remember the old carnivals that would come to town and that sort of stuff, and they would have these sideshows, and they would have these games where you'd win stuff and everything.
Oh, I worked in one when I was 16. I came to Newego, and they gave me a part-time job running the concession where you shot a BB gun and so yeah, I know them. I remember those carnivals.
I knew that about you. We've known each other for so many. I didn't know that, but so get this: when Richard Nixon was 16 and 17, Prescott, Arizona, they would have their big rodeo carnival days, and there was and the people who owned different people would own the concessions, and the people that did what was a shady game called the Wheel of Fortune. It was a mob-run game, and they hired young Richard Nixon to do that game, and they basically taught him how to fleece people with a smile, so they'll come back and let you fleece them again.
Oh, is that bizarre?
And so Nixon actually used that when he was in the military. He never actually saw combat or anything, but Nixon actually got some of the money he used to run for Congress in World War II from playing poker with his buddies, and he won. In today's money, it would. I think in today's money, we could be talking about between $100,000-$200,000 in poker. And
running rigged games, fixed games.
Well, probably they were rigged, but the important thing is the people still loved him, even though he was shafting them, and so and then you go in the people who helped who also helped to fund his first runs for office, were the Los Angeles Mafia, a guy by the name of Mickey Cohen. They helped to finance, along with Howard Hughes and the big Eastern banks, his runs for Congress, then when he ran for the Senate, and then, of course, they're still supporting him when he's vice president for 8 years. And then when Nixon is finally president, elected, in a very close race in 68, takes office 69, the plumbers, two of the plumbers, as I mentioned before, they were active, full-time mafia members for Santo Trafficante, and Nixon, basically most of the plumbers had worked on Nixon's plots to kill Castro right before the 60 election. That's why he used these guys to burglarize the Watergate and the Chilean embassy, because Castro had prepared a report that had all that stuff in it. So Nixon had a long mafia history, and when we come back, we can talk about Trump's long mafia history.